Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the panel Leadership in a Changing World. My name is Ming Tan, and I am the founding executive director of the Tech for Good Institute and also a council member for the Council for Board Diversity. The Tech for Good Institute is a non-profit organization seed-funded by Grab with a mission to leverage the promise and potential of technology to build a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable Southeast Asia. And one of the driving factors behind the institute's establishment is the recognition of technology's impact, both positive and negative, in an increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. As leaders in the private and public sector, as well as in the nonprofit and civil sector, I think all of us here have been confronted by this term, VUCA. Such are the times that we find ourselves in. Organizations have to be agile, as President said before, to respond to volatility, that is, rapid fluctuations in the operating environment. In a data-driven world, we still find ourselves uncertain when we need to weigh risks and make decisions in the face of incomplete information. And the complexity of our interconnected world requires systems thinking to ensure that we steward sustainable growth and innovation. And then there are those unknown unknowns. Those are the really gnarly ones, for which there are no precedents and for which there is no playbook. So instead of processes and systems, we then need to build culture to prepare organizations to thrive amidst ambiguity. And against this landscape, boards are called upon to ensure performance according to today's metrics while shaping the trajectory of the organization for tomorrow. In other words, the best boards stay 2 steps ahead, not just looking ahead, but also round the corner. An effective board can make all the difference between this VUCA world feeling really chaotic and distressing to one that is full of potential and opportunity. And at the Council of Board Diversity, our hypothesis is that different perspectives, expertise, and experience can help boards navigate this rapidly changing world. So it gives me great pleasure to share the next hour with our speakers today who will share their insights on this topic. They really need no introduction, I'm sure you know them all, but let me highlight a few areas of particular relevance to today's conversation. Ms Euleen Goh, on my left, has extensive experience as chair and board member that spans the private, public, and civil sectors in Singapore and also overseas. She currently chairs SATS Limited, the Singapore Institute of Management, and DBS Foundation. She recently retired as the deputy chairman for Royal Dutch Shell plc as well. Other important entities that currently benefit from her counsel, because if I included the past, we would be here all day, the Singapore Health Services Private Limited, the Singapore Institute of International Affairs Endowment Fund, the Singapore Institute of Directors, and the Public Service Commission. Ms Geraldine Chin is the chairman and managing director of ExxonMobil Asia Pacific Limited, and like Euleen, is a member of Singapore's Public Service Commission. Over 3 decades with ExxonMobil, she has held a broad range of positions spanning sales and marketing, commercial, planning and strategy, technical research, and HR. She is also the managing director of ExxonMobil Asia Holdings Private Limited and the director of ExxonMobil China Petroleum and Petrochemical Private Limited. Ms Chew Gek Khim is chairman of the Straits Trading Company Limited, executive chairman of the Tercity Group, executive director of Tercity Asset Management, and deputy chairman of the Tan Chin Tuan Foundation. She also chairs Malaysia Smelting Corporation Berhad and ARA Trust Management Suntec Limited. Kim also lends her experience on other boards, including the Singapore Exchange, the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and the NUS Board of Trustees. Prof Cheong Koon Hean wears many hats and is responsible for a lot of what we see around us in the built environment. As chair of the Lee Kuan Yew School of she is currently the chair of the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities and the Center for Liveable Cities. She is also Singapore's non-resident ambassador to Finland. Koon Hean provides her expertise and experience to the boards of NUS and Capital Land, as well as on many advisory committees, including the Asia Sustainable Infrastructure Advisory Panel. She played a key role in conceptualizing the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize and is its nominating chairman. Ms Diaan-Yi Lin is a senior partner at McKinsey Company, where she previously led the Singapore office and now leads McKinsey's work in Asia across the social, public, and healthcare sectors. Over the last 20 years, she has supported boards and management teams in transforming their businesses, including building new digital assets, transforming organizations, and expanding regional footprints. Diaan-Yi is also a board member of Viva Foundation for Children with Cancer. So I hope you learned something new about your friends here today. So let's dive in, and I'll start with a broad opening question. In this VUCA world, rapidly changing all the time, what's one area that I'd like to ask each of you that has emerged maybe over the last 5 years that traditional governance boards may not have had to deal with previously? Euleen, maybe you can start.
Well, let me start by wishing everybody good morning and say what a privilege it is to be up here sharing my stories and my experiences. I think all of you are leaders. You all have your stories and experiences, so thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. Like Mildred, I think when this panel was conceived, I wasn't in the room. I hadn't attended that meeting, so just make sure you're around when volunteers are being looked for. So your question, Ming, is so what's different?
What's new,
yeah,
basically, that you have seen in your experience?
Yeah.
What's new in the last 5 years?
Yeah. So everybody's used the term VUCA, which is here to stay. Importantly is what Ming has just said. It's not just that it's a VUCA world, it's the pace of change that's happening in the world, which means we often do not have much time to react, if at all. And therefore, I think the most important thing for any board that's facing the world ahead is, in my view, to have as big a radar screen as possible. We need to look at the radar screen and to look at risks and opportunities that come about. And we need to think widely in terms of what are the possibilities and the potentials. And therefore, in those considerations is when the board can be a lot more effective in just preparing for what possibly might lie ahead. I'd like to share a little snippet of a story from my own experience. So I'm sitting in a meeting, and I said to the people who were presenting a proposal for consideration, we've gone through everything. It was my final question. I said, if we made this decision, how would it look like on this side of the table, on the opposite side of the table? How do you think your competitors will look at it? How do you think your other stakeholders will look at it? And the chairman got really upset with me. What do you mean the opposite sides of the table? You're one team. Then no, you shouldn't be on the opposite side of the table. And my response to that is, before you make that decision, you have to look at every angle. You have to look at every side of the table. Once you have made the decision, you execute as one team. I have to be very fair to that chairman. He was terrific. He came up and he said, good comments. So I think that's what's relevant, pertinent, and urgent in today's times. Think broadly, think hugely, think through all angles, and that's where diversity comes in.
Thank you, and that's a great reminder, especially when you're faced with a massive agenda and there feels sometimes a pressure to get through the agenda, is to take that time for sense-making and for deliberation before the decision. Thank you. Geraldine?
Yes, thank you very much for having me here today. I reflected on President Halima's comments earlier on what she saw as the future areas. And she named two, right? The energy transition and technology. And of course, where I am today, we're actually the tip of the spear in energy transition, sustainability, and climate change. It is particularly existential for the sector that I am in, but it's not just about our sector, it impacts every single one of us. And sustainability, climate change, and energy transition needs to be on the agenda of every single board today and into the future. But it's particularly acute for us being in the energy and the chemicals industry. And so it feels very black sometimes. It feels very dire for this sector, especially amongst young people. They come up to me, and I get this all the time. Why should we join you? You're not going to exist in another 20 years. And I'm going like, yes, but what we do today has to transform. This is about business transformation. It's the transformation of the entire industry. We all have to get there, not just the sector. We all have to get there for the good of humankind. And we have to get there faster than we are going today. And it's important to be able to reframe as leaders and as boards the strategic direction that is needed. That is a much more positive direction. So I tell the young people, imagine when was the last new industry the world has ever created? It's probably digital and tech. Between now and 2050, the world has to create two brand new industries from scratch: the carbon industry and the hydrogen industry. We have to understand the science, turn that science into technology, turn that technology into scale-up and commercialization. We have to figure out how to move these new forms of energy around the world so supply chains come into play. We have to figure out how to deliver these new forms of energy to companies that you sit on, but also to consumers. Accompanying all of that, governments and regulators have to figure out completely brand new laws and how to regulate this space. We also have to come up with new business models. This is not good. Your business models are not going to work. And of course, some of the historical fundamentals stay because energy has always been closely tied with geopolitics, because where the energy is used is typically not where the energy is available. And once you have cross-country, geopolitics comes into play. So it's actually an extremely exciting time, because how many of us have the opportunity to be right in the front row in the creation of two brand new industries as we go forward, to be able to address the energy transition, sustainability, and a just transition. So being on boards and trying to create that vision of the future, despite VUCA, none of us knows how to get there. We all know it's going to be extremely choppy and bumpy. We're going to be barking up wrong trees. We're going to have to reverse. Some things are going to pay out and some things are not. But being able to set that vision and that positivity, because we need all of that positive energy together, not only within the sector, but across all sectors to get there.
Thank you so much, Geraldine. And I think this is particularly relevant for our part of the world. We're a rapidly developing region, and development takes energy. And so this is really important. Thank you so much. Kim?
If I might put a slightly different spin, I don't think that we are unique in living in, or to say that it's a VUCA world now. I think the world has gone through many transitions. We've seen the Great Depression, we've seen two wars, we've seen geopolitics change, we've seen the communism as we knew in the 60s, completely different today. So we've seen many, many changes. I think the challenge is there are long periods where things remain the same, 10 years, 50, and then you have a period of change. And during those periods, back to Euleen's point, I think that perspective is important, and that's where diversity comes in. When you have a big group of people with different perspectives, experiences, it's helpful. It's like getting a team to think together and to look at a problem differently. And to that end, whether it's women, I think it's not just about having men and women. It's about having people of different age groups, different experiences, different educational perspectives. All that is useful in dealing with an issue. The challenge, and just to give a little anecdote, when we were looking 2 years back about the economy, it was an elderly lady who suddenly said, you know, this feels like 1960s. And then we scratched our heads like, oh dear, some of us weren't born. And then we said, okay, we'll go look up. And what we found is post-60s, there was a period of inflation. And then the central banks were grappling to deal with it. I must confess, even after doing all our research, we didn't quite get it right. But it was interesting that she raised it. Going back to diversity of people on boards, the challenge then is, yeah, it's great to have all these different people. The challenge is managing them because everybody will talk differently. Everybody will look at things differently. So when you have you have the perfect board, it's diverse in terms of experience and age and gender, it's actually very tough on the chairman because you need to kind of pull these people together. Assuming they all get along and they're nice, you still have to be able to tease out the relevance of what they say and pull it together and then come up with something coherent.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's so true. It's not just getting the right people in the room, but also creating space for them to be able to speak and then drawing that path to action, like Geraldine says. Thank you. Koon Hean?
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thank you for having me here. I think amongst this group, I'm the one with the longest public service experience record. I hope to bring a slightly different perspective. But one thing I realized is that, as Gek Khim have said, a lot of things we face is not new. We've had multiple challenges and crises over the decades. But my own experience is that somehow in this last decade or so, a lot of these crises converge and they have compounding effects, which means the disruptions are very great, right? So we, whether it's management or as board, face a problem of, I think there's a tension. On the one hand, because of these trends, threats, and opportunities, you need to have foresight. So I think more than ever, there is a need for some capability in the foresight. Actually, it's quite, there's a conflict, right? On the one hand, the foresight enables you to stretch and look further, which you need to. As someone has said, you have to look straight, you have to look round the corners and be prepared of what's going to be thrown at you. But on the other hand, life goes on daily, you know. And then you have all these short term. Now you don't have to do your quarterly reporting. Maybe that's not so difficult as previously, but you have a problem because you then have the short term. So both board and management face this problem of the long term and the short term. And I'm afraid the answer is we have to manage both. You cannot do one without the other. So I just give two very simple anecdotes. One is from my own experience in HDB as a public sector board, right? I was the CEO, but at the same time, I have to work with the board. The thing with a lot of government policies, and because of the constraints of Singapore, you have to have a very long-term view. And it's important to know that whatever decision you make now must be in the context of the long-term view. Because if you don't, you're going to be in trouble. I'm no longer in public service. In a public sector, you have to think of the political issues, but you also have to think of the constraints. So if you have a very populist government, you might be actually making all the wrong decisions for the long term. So that's a very difficult thing to handle, right? But at the same time, you do have to handle a lot of the ups and downs. The property cycle is one of them. So it is very difficult. But I always remind everyone that you really have to have the long-term view when you take that short-term decision. It's very important, or you make a very big strategic mistake. So systems leadership become very important. The leaders, be it on the board or on the management, have to look at things as a system, not as individual decisions. So it's a little bit like we all face this, right? We are changing the wheels on the bus as the bus is moving. And that is always very difficult. Now I'm on also a private sector board, maybe I'm the voice that always remind people, take the strategic view, right? We talked about living in a very carbon-constrained world. It's already hit us. So it's become part of the business. It's no longer a nice to have. You have to do it. You have no choice. But what does it mean for the company? So all your business models, the way you operate, the way you manage, the way you brand, all has to change. So that's the long-term view. So I think you have to set aside the mindset that, oh, we have to do it because of the regulation. No, you have to do it because it's now part of the business. So I'll just stop there. So my point really is this ability for foresight and systems leadership is very important. But at the same time, you really have to learn to change the wheels of the bus as the bus is moving. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dian-Yi, you have advised both public sector and many private sector boards, and as managing director, managing partner at McKinsey, you've also had to manage some very, very high quality people, all of whom have very independent minds. So perhaps you can give us some perspective from your point of view.
Thank you. It's always hard to answer a question at the end of a chain, so I won't repeat many esteemed views. But I think maybe we build on what others have said, right? Which is, if you think about what's new to a board, it actually then means that a whole new set of capabilities need to exist in the board and the management team. And one new skill that the boards, at least I've seen, have had to start to get more involved in is talent management. Because whether you are looking at sustainability, technology, new business models, when you have this telescope, microscope need, you're going to need a management team who's going to be able to deal with this. We've all sat in boards where you've had to have the discussion, do we need a chief sustainability officer? Or is sustainability something we need to embed across the organization, right? And we've seen many versions of this. It used to be risk, then it was technology, now it's sustainability. So one observation, at least I've seen, is that the skill of boards to get into that talent management, not just amongst themselves, but into the management team, and what are the capabilities that need to be spread across the management team or within just certain people, is something that, boards I think will continue to have to play quite a big role in. By the way, both in the public, private, and the social sector, the charity sector as well, because they all face the same challenges.
Thank you. I'll just pick up on that point because McKinsey runs a global practice, right? So just picking up on what you see as evolving skill sets and needs, how do you compare and contrast them to what you're seeing across Asia as well as globally in terms of the emerging needs in composing boards for effectiveness?
So let me start with maybe some commonalities and we talk about some differences, right? I know we don't want too many numbers, and Boon Chye had set some out. But I think it's worthwhile if we start first with, do we need to think about composition? Right? Now, we may all have philosophical views. You can be Mao, like women hold up half the world. Euleen started us and Kim continue around the importance of diversity, right? What we found actually with business leaders, the most compelling is either to have an economic argument or an organizational argument. And so in 2007, 15 years ago now, my colleagues actually did some very seminal research that showed, and I use my words carefully, correlation between, in this case, it was limited to gender diversity and economic performance. What they found was that top quartile companies in gender diversity outperformed their sector peers in profitability. Depending on the measure, whether you look at ROE, EBIT, EBITDA, as much as 1 to 4 percentage points. So sizable if you're driving economic performance. The same correlation exists. We have millions of data points with companies that we've worked with to measure how healthy an organization is. When we talk about healthy, we say more resilient, more agile, innovative, more collaborative, et cetera, right? Similar correlation. Companies with the high gender diversity in the top quartile almost have 2 times the health quotient of companies in the bottom quartile, right? So if you're to get to your question, Ming, we should care lah, right? Is the short answer, because it does drive performance. Now I note all the statisticians are going to come to me afterwards and say this is correlation, not causation, right? But there is what we find, kind of anecdotally is healthy organizations are what drive performance, and diversity, as Minnie has said, somehow your ability to get a healthy organization is better, perhaps because of these different perspectives. So that's something that we see common. The study has been run, listed companies, non-listed companies, it's been run in the US, in Europe, it's run in Asia. You get roughly the same sort of results, some bouncing depending on the data set. I think what is unique in Asia is something that we saw actually in the data that Boon Chye and Mildred had shown. Asia has two types of companies that are a little bit different than the rest of the world. We have a higher proportion of state-owned entities, and we have, I would say, a slightly different style of family-type companies. Right? If we take the example that was cited of the Philippines actually has quite good numbers in terms of board representation, an economy that is actually very heavily skewed family, and one of the few societies that actually you see a lot of women. Right? Now, we're not going to have a social discussion about why and how, etc., but you see that happen. We found in our research as well that SOEs, when governments are focused on this, SOEs, and we saw the data with the stat boards, this is a lever that governments can use, and actually stat boards where you have strong public service to draw from, the board representation also moves much more quickly with gender diversity. So those are two changes. And it's weird, right? Because you would think Malaysia not the most happening of all time. So actually Malaysia very high. You can argue whether they use the soft target quota of 30% as a lever. We see that emerging in some of the Vietnamese companies. We see it in Indonesia, where they draw from the strong public sector as well. Right? So those are some of the commonalities that I think we'll all see, but also some of the differences and some additional levers that we have here in Asia.
Thank you so much. And thank you for giving us that regional point of view as well. Maybe I'll come to you, Euleen, because you've been chair of many boards in many of these different sectors. And can I ask you about the evolution of your thinking over your long experience on how a chairman can work with the board and with the NRC to compose a board? And from your perspective, how do you initiate and how do you activate this evolution?
Thank you, Min. I have to say I agree with all the views of my fellow panelists. I think the key, which Diaan-Yi had expressed so well, is it's a business imperative. People look at it as a social imperative. And that's not quite the right angle that we should look at. It is a business imperative. And why is it a business imperative? I think it's been mentioned this morning by Madam Halima, our president. And actually, I'd like to quote Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. I was on a forum. He was the main speaker. And he was asked about the fertility rate of Singapore. And he then turned to, it's because of women in the workforce. And he said in those early days, it was recognized that you cannot miss out on half the talent in your population. And so when we are looking at boards and the composition of boards, we've got to look far more widely in terms of all the talents that are available. And now I'm going to slip in something, and I hope the men don't mind me saying it. Many in Singapore are very clubby and quite often look for the same model as themselves. Same golf course, read the same books, go to the same restaurants, etc. So when we are looking at boards, we have to look at a board that is not stereotyped and the same model, because if that happens, you have blind spots. So I think that's the first thing in composing a board. The second is to think about how it's aligned to the company and the company's business. So as an example, SETS has just acquired a big European American business. So the board is now being reshaped because we need talents that have insights, experience, cultural awareness of those areas that we operate in. So another aspect is to say, so how do we align with the interests of the board? Now remember what's just been said by Madam Halima. Women decide quite a lot on consumer purchases. Therefore, if you have a business that looks to consumers buying your goods or services, and I would reckon that we all do, then you're missing out if you don't have that kind of diversity on your panel. I was on a session when Forrest Lee was talking about sea. And he said, you know, there's one aspect, this many years ago, that Singaporeans miss out on in terms of diversity. And he said, that's a socio-economic segmentation. We don't deal very well through that segmentation. So I'm just naming you aspects of different forms of diversity. And so as a board, we really need to consider widely. Because back to what we were saying, we need to think broadly in order to have a full discussion, a substantive discussion, to arrive at the decision. And then it is about making sure that all views are heard and encouraged. And that's, again, a different skill set that Kim talks about. Because then it's important that nobody gets overlooked in the course of it. I think that's a long answer to your question.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Kim, Euleen just mentioned you, and so I'm going to arrow you. From the perspective of business, for example, you spoke before, quite clearly about the importance for the different points of view to be able to have that both forward as well as backwards. As I'm an engineer turned historian, so what you just mentioned about being able to learn from the past as well as to be able to bring different points of view for the future, really important. But how might you encourage both current as well as aspiring chairmen to think more broadly about the recruitment of board members, look beyond the club, as Euleen mentioned, to bring the diversity of people into the room, and then to be able to bring the diversity of views to the table, both for strategic management, looking ahead, as well as risk management, protecting the business?
First of all, I think it's a little easier now because it's more common to use headhunters as opposed to in the old days when you just relied on recommendations. I've been on boards where they have used headhunters and given specs. The challenge, I think, and I'm not criticizing, is that people need to feel comfortable. So in my own personal experience, I found that sometimes men are nervous. So for example, I was asked to sit on a board and I said, no, thanks, but I'm busy. And here's a list of names of other women who are better qualified and whom I think are more suitable. And his reply was, no thanks, I don't know them. I was shocked. But when you think about it, it's correct. He doesn't know them. He doesn't want the names because what if I don't get along? What if they're very difficult? What if I can't manage them? So his response was a very human response. Should you encourage people to be more open? Perhaps. But I think the other challenge we have, and it's changing, is also the groups we mix in. When I first started, I was dealing with somebody, then he said, do you play golf? Then I said, no. And then there was silence. And then I realized it's stuck. He cannot connect with me. I don't play golf. I can't say, do you want to go shopping with me? So it's very difficult. But I mean, these are true obstacles. Over time, people get, and I see that the younger generation's a lot easier. People speak more freely. People mix more freely. So I think we will overcome. But people need to be more open-minded. And going beyond gender, I had the same experience in a Malaysian company. You know, we have a small tin mining smelting company. And for something like 30 years, nobody did mining. So the mining engineers and geologists are either 60 years old or 20 years old. So in between, you have nobody. So my poor old CEO was stuck and said, I can't find people. So I said, okay, don't worry, we'll try engineers, we'll try chemists. And it worked. But the point I'm trying to make is that you need to look beyond. So if the person doesn't have the specific skill, he's not a geologist, he's not a mining engineer, then you make do. You make do with the guy who's a chemistry expert. You make do with a civil engineer. And if they're smart, they learn on the job. So I think that need to be more open-minded about different people. Maybe give people a chance. Well, I mean, don't be so nervous like, I don't know her and who knows what she'll do to me. You know, that kind of fear, we have to overcome that. And we also need to be more prepared to let people with more general skills come in. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Do you want to say something, Euleen?
If I may just add something to what Kim has said, and it's a very relevant point, that what Kim is saying is that we can and should think about recruiting outside a very domain deep knowledge. Because if you recruit more and more people into that domain knowledge, you're missing out on other aspects of the business. And actually broadening those expertise strengthens the business, particularly in today's world.
Yeah, you put it very well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And to be able to think of those transferable skills as well is super important. I remember, this is not board related, but when Google first started, I don't know if there's anyone here from Google, so you can verify my story, which is obviously they didn't have enough software engineers and they were trying to build a search engine. So who did they look for? They looked for librarians. Because who's better at categorizing information than librarians? Couldn't code? That's okay. We can get coders for that. But to be able to build a business is to look broader. Geraldine, maybe I can come back to you. Everyone here, it's great because we have people here from the public sector, private sector, civil sector. And sometimes when you say the word board, actually the role of board and the role of the board and relationship with management can be very different. And even in the private sector, from a big MNC to a private company to a public listed company, the relationships are very different. The stakeholders are very different. Can I ask you to draw upon your experience, having worn so many hats in a very complex organization, to just reflect a little bit on the challenge of stakeholder management in different types of boards and maybe even in different jurisdictions?
Yeah, indeed. I think Singapore is really a land of wonderful opportunities because many Asia Pacific or regional headquarters are located here. So we get a chance to sit on boards and work with companies from across the region. So when you go across the region, the board culture and the business culture is very different. Some of them can be some board meetings really extremely stiff and scripted, right? My first one that was outside of Singapore, you're going like, okay, your support staff comes out and they give you all these scripts and you have to go to that script. And you go like, so how do I operate as a board member in such a scripted situation? But I think it's very important for chairmen of boards to make sure that when they're bringing in board members that have got less experience, maybe more junior, like Kim was referring to, you take somebody and give them a try. You really have to sit them down and think about the difference between management and governance. And that was something that I've struggled with when I first came onto boards. Because within an MNC, we'll sit on boards where you are actually managing the business from a regional perspective, but you're on the board of a country-specific affiliated company. So that's really tough, just trying to wear the two different hats. And then when you get more complexity, what happens if that company is a joint venture? And in that joint venture, each joint venturer gets to appoint a director on the board. Now you've got a third hat. You're representing the interests of the shareholder and not only the fiduciary responsibility you have to that particular company. And of course, JV parties, normally when you start in a JV, everything's happy, everybody's hunky-dory. But over time, business situations change, the environment changes, and your business interest starts to shift. So it wasn't where it was. It's sometimes those shifts are fairly gentle, and other times in a VUCA world it changes massively. Then how, then there is a chance for how do you bridge conflicts within the board. And you have to do that in the context of a culture that need not necessarily be one that you're used to. And as Euleen had pointed out, what does it look like from the other side of the table? You really have to go and look at all aspects around the table, look at it through the lens of your other directors' eyes. And they are wearing different hats too, right? Because they're managing their business, they've got a P&L to manage, of which the JV rolls up into their P&L. They are also having to represent their shareholder interests. And so it's so important to actually go around and think about how the others on the board and their perspectives to try and come to this consensus and not let board decisions get hung.
Thank you so much. Koon Hean, like Geraldine, like many of us here in this room, we've sat on both sides of the table. You have sat on both sides of the table as CEO and then as board member or as chair. Can I ask you to reflect on what a healthy relationship between board and management looks like and maybe even how that's changing?
Thank you. I think one of the problems is because many of us are in executive positions. So there's always this tendency to want to take over and run the company. So the chairman always would be in a very difficult position. But absolutely right. There's so many hats you wear when you sit on the board. But in my own experience, I've had observed rather good practices from both management and the board. The first point is the board needs to build trust with the management. Sometimes it's difficult when it becomes very contentious, right? But it's about building trust. I've sat on many boards, and some of the boards where you have an excellent CEO and management team, there isn't very much you need to do because they're doing their job. But I've also sat on boards where it's a weak CEO, and then that's the problem, right? Where we are all itching to try and take over his job, which we should not. So I think this balance is very, very important, and to be clear on where we are when we sit on the board. But some anecdotes, I've had seen good CEOs where when they come on board, this is a new CEO. How do you onboard a new CEO? That's one way of looking at it. They are very good in actually reaching out to individual board members to speak to them, to run through the ideas. And I think this is a very clever CEO because they recognize certain boards have certain members have certain strengths, and they want to tap on the strength of that board member, run through the ideas, and see whether when he proposed to the board, is it going to fly? Or he will be shot down. So I thought that's a very wise CEO. Now, the other part is that where I, as a CEO, have to onboard a new chairman. That's the other way around. Sometimes I have to persuade people to be the chairman. And so it has to be a trust built with the board chairman where you keep them posted of why certain decisions are made the way they are, particularly if you're in the public service. Now, I will also want to make, so it's this building trust. And the board also needs to be adaptable, to allow the team to actually be innovative, the management team. But at the same time, having oversight on the risk. How do you manage those risks or some new initiative that they want to take that can take the company to a new level or get the company into a lot of trouble? So I think that's the other balance we need to strike. I just want to mention about board diversity. I've been in one or two boards where the chairman's very good, and there's a very deliberate attempt to bring on board diversity linked to the strategy of the company. Because if the company, or in my case, I'm also like Gek Khim involved in the National University of Singapore on the board of trustees. If you want to take a certain direction, you constantly look at the board composition to see, do we have the right people? So if you want to take the university onto a more entrepreneurship direction, I would bring on board more entrepreneurs who could help, right? So if now there's a lot of discussion about sustainability, I would bring on board someone who knows a little bit more about sustainability. So there's a very deliberate attempt, and specific boards I've seen where they actually have all your names in their database, or many of your names. They know who's out there. And when it's time to do that succession planning, it's a very deliberate way of reaching out to the right people to get the right composition. So I think these are some of the lessons I've learned sitting on various boards. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all this great food for thought. I'd like to open up, we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'd like to invite questions from the audience. We have 3 mics roving. Please ask questions. Because we only have 10 minutes, I'd ask you to maybe ask a general question as opposed to just direct it to a single person. Please introduce yourself as well so we know where you're from. One over on the left.
Thank you. I have a comment for everybody's consideration, actually for the whole room's consideration. My name is Maya Hari. I sit on a few boards here in the region, and I run a company called Terrascope in climate tech. One of the things that I'm always very struck by is that our terminologies and our vocabulary that we use around how we talk about chair people, for instance, chairman versus chair people, chairperson, needs to kind of start being inclusive in how we think. The tech world kind of has moved to terminology that thinks more inclusively. So it's something for everybody's consideration. It doesn't even occur to me when I say chairman or chairing a committee, but I actually welcome everybody to think about even the words that we as women use to be more inclusive. So just that, and it was actually a lovely conversation. I learned so much from every one of you today.
Thank you. Language does matter, and we've been using chair. So thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, in the back, in the orange or yellow.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'd just like to also comment about the diversity of colors that we see out there. Normally, it is a sea of navy and black, and today we see something different. Good morning. My name is Euleen Goh. I am a venture partner at early stage venture capital fund, so I invest in technology startups. I'm also executive board chair of an ESG startup in the wine and spirits industry. My question, I go back to the comment about how we are having an existentialist crisis in the world. And on top of that, we have the advent of ChatGPT, generative AI, and how that is changing the face of industries we can expect, and how that could also result at the same time in tremendous loss of jobs, right? And as boards, as we contemplate all these new changes, which are also happening at an exponentially faster pace than what has happened before. When you think about it, sitting on boards, chairing boards of companies, public sector, or even as a country, do you think we are currently equipped to deal with it? And if not, given your context, what would you want to have happen even within your own respective organizations? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Euleen. Any do I?
So maybe I just pick up on one comment, and this ties to something Kim has said before. We, as a kind of global world, are not foreign to disruption and change, right? And actually, every time, whether you start at the Industrial Revolution or whichever, right, wherever you want to start, new technology comes in. And yes, there are certain types of jobs that disappear, but new jobs are also simultaneously created, right? So I'll do a small pitch for my colleague, Michael Chewy, who has done analysis of actually technology has been one of our greatest net job creators, right? Because it actually, has advances into a whole set of new fields. And for the parents out there who always want to guide their children into what subjects they should study, what jobs they should take, by definition, you don't know what those are, right? Because, they will be classified by DOS today as other, right? Because they don't exist, right? So the first point I wanted to share is that it actually results in, statistics has shown us and history has shown us, it results in net job creation. Now we get to your second stickier point though, which is education systems, the way we work, etc., are all set a particular way, and we don't know when a child starts P1 or Set1 or even university, what that job is going to look like, right? And so, systems will have to change and to start to focus a lot more on core skills, right? And that's, Singapore, I think, has done a very good job around how do we, lifelong continuous reskilling, and it becomes incumbent on employers, but also us as individuals to partake in this continuous reskilling, right? So everyone here will never have looked at a carbon technology when you started your job. In the last year, we've all learned what the power of hydrogen and everything else is, right? So this continuous learning is just going to have to become part and parcel of us. And I think for board members, it's imperative that the board is continuous learning. You ensure your management team is continuously learning, and that your employees and the sector and the ecosystem they operate in are continuously learning. Right? I think it's the only way we can solve with uncertainty.
Can I just add? I absolutely agree with you, Euleen, and with what Diaan-Yi has said. Firstly, I think all manpower is precious, particularly in today's world. And therefore, all board needs to look at their manpower to try and make sure that they are maximized in terms of their potential and their contribution. And that means helping them ahead of time before the change happens. The second thing that I'd like to add is there is one aspect that we need to think about as a board. We need to help people unskill to reskill. Because if you don't help people unskill, they're stuck in their former box, so to speak. And helping people to unskill and then reskill is important. And finally, I'll come to labels. Job roles might change, job tasks may not change. And so we've got to help people rethink what are new tasks, what are new learnings. And the most important thing, I think, for an organization to survive and survive well is to be a learning organization.
Thank you. Geraldine, did you have a comment?
Yes, speaking up on Diane's point, the way I look at it personally is that you need to distinguish between the fundamental skill set and domain knowledge. And you need to separate between the two. So in my particular space, an engineer is an engineer is an engineer. Whether we are handling petrol or whether we're handling hydrogen, we still need the fundamentals. We need compressors, we need pumps, we need reactor vessels. And engineers are trained to do that, right? But the conditions change, right? The temperatures, the pressures at which we run that. But the engineers are trained to calculate, right? Whether in this or that space. So what you need to add is the specific domain understanding and expertise, and whether that's knowing what temperature ammonia liquefies at, or in our particular case at the board level, understanding what are the pathways to reducing carbon. That is just additional domain knowledge, and to segregate that from the skills. So we need to have people with excellent basic skills, but learning how to apply that in a new domain.
Thank you so much. I'd love to pick up that comment that you also mentioned about that the board has also to keep learning. And as a shout out to the chairs here, which is how do you create a learning environment within the board? I mean, time is short, people are busy, and also these are very high level people that you have. How do you create that opportunity to keep learning within that particular sector that you're overseeing with that organization? Something to think about. Maybe one last question. Yes, one may, is it? Yeah. Maybe you wait for a mic.
Thank you. I'm Wan Mei from Aegon Zender. I'm the managing partner in Singapore. Thank you for a fantastic conversation earlier. I wanted to just touch on Diane's point actually on talent management across the organization, but actually also for the board and it touches also actually on Ming, what you said about learning culture. What we've seen a lot of, and I'm just raising this as a point as we look at global boards and place people on global boards for our clients, is there's a high use of advisory boards or advisory members who are then able to actually provide a point of view to help the boards actually learn, and also for chairs and board members to get used to actually getting to know people with different spikes. If I think about the topic of sustainability, it's such a vast area, right? Where no one is actually an expert in the whole field. There's a technical side, there's a strategic side of it. And hence, the use of advisory members, and I suspect that actually be great for this group as well, to get, to get Kim's point on, I don't know this person. It's to use advisory boards to actually get to know more people, to gain greater diversity on the boards.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know we're standing between you and lunch, but I think there was a gentleman on this side who had his hand up for a while. Yes.
Hello, Mark Laudy. I'm a communications coach and producer of the CBD 5th anniversary video. Sorry, Sweeling, I'm contributing to the navy blue today, unlike you. My question is twofold. One, what is the essence of the reason for why public organizations in Singapore are doing better with diversity than boards of private companies or publicly listed companies? And second, it's interesting to hear the conversation go beyond gender. And in the 5 years that I've been associated with the CBD, that's a first. So far, we've only ever spoken about gender diversity. Now I'm starting to hear things like racial diversity. And I'd just like to also hear your thoughts as to what the benefits, the business benefits of that racial diversity might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Would anybody like to take that?
Maybe
Koon Hean?
I'll take that.
And then
I
we'll come
think
to
you
Euleen.
asked about why public sector boards tend to have greater diversity. I think it's just a deliberate attempt when you try to bring the board members together, that you go and look for people that gives you this diversity, and it actually includes racial diversity. And of course, particularly for government public sector boards, racial diversity is very important because you are developing policies that's going to affect everybody in Singapore. But if you are talking about private sector board, I think it's also very important. The same reason why you want gender diversity, it's the same reason why you want racial diversity, because your customers is such a whole range of people. And this is on top of having skills diversity. So when I see diversity, I don't mean gender. It's everything, right? Gender, race, skills. Age is the other one, age. So the other thing is we said that boards tend to be a happy huddle of, I don't want to say old boys club or old club, all right, that a lot of us know each other. But actually, we also have to bring in the young people. They have a very different perspective. So I think diversity should be in the broadest sense of the word. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Koon Hean. Euleen?
Let me just say that, firstly, it's a reflection, I think, for the public sector, that the leadership in Singapore acknowledges that we should try and make sure that we are looking widely to all the available talent. And kudos to that leadership. Secondly, there is an aspect that many who are in executive roles are not allowed to take part in unlisted company boards. Geraldine might be in that position. They can on public sector boards. So there is a bigger funnel of availability. Third thing that I want to say, and the last thing, is a shout out for gender diversity. I am one for all diversity, but I think there is a reason for gender diversity. It's the most visible reflection of a company's culture and values. And if you have good gender diversity, it's the first step towards telling people that there's diversity, there's equity, and there's inclusion as a value for the company. And I think that's why, think widely on diversity, but gender is a key one and a huge important first step for any company.
Thank you so much. We have one last question. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies, gentlemen. My name is Su-Yen. I serve on a number of different boards in Singapore and overseas. I'm also speaking in my capacity as chairperson of the Singapore Institute of Directors. Thank you so much for the really engaging conversation this morning, and many of the points that all the panelists made really resonated. I guess one of the things that I'm reflecting on is how, in order to move the needle, it really does take a village. And it takes the part of individual board directors, it takes the part of council board diversity and organizations like the Singapore Institute of Directors. And perhaps one shout out to everyone is to be part of that community. Because at the end of the day, we talked about, how you get to meet people, how do you network, how do you build your capabilities in a holistic way. And so a few things that the Institute has been doing, for those who might not be aware, is, for example, a partnering program with the Singapore Computer Society for board readiness program for women in tech. So that serves a number of different constituents and solves for different problems. We're building a competency model that includes areas like sustainability, technology, and human capital and strategy. So it goes beyond the compliance part of being a director to being actually how you drive performance and transformation as well. So I think all of these different factors really matter. And when we try to build this community and this ecosystem, it's to be part of that ecosystem. So I would just encourage everyone to all be, sort of lean in, as we all do, engage, network, and perhaps be part of the community as well. And again, Singapore Institute of Directors really partners with all organizations, including CBD, to try and really bring this village together. So thank you for the wonderful conversation again. This is so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Su-Yen. We're almost out of time. I'll just have one last question for our panel here, although I love it that we're getting such great comments from the floor as well. It feels much more like a conversation than just 6 of us up here. How about a quick fire round here? Looking back at each of your different experiences, can I ask in one sentence, maybe 2, what single piece of advice would you give to somebody who is taking up the role of chair for the very first time in today's world?
Yep.
We'll start from DY.
Okay, so one sentence. Deal with incompatibility and underperformance quickly. Don't stew on it. People have a tendency to let it linger for too long.
Thank you. Koon Hean?
Be open and embrace change.
Sorry, I was going to say the same thing. Be open-minded.
You can have more than one
Koon
sentence.
Hean, you just have to see what the world throws at you. You have to be open-minded, and you have to just take what comes.
Thank you, Geraldine.
In a VUCA world, everybody doesn't know where it's going, so seize the day.
Thank you, Euleen. Last word.
I would say reach out. Reach out, be unfazed with the changes that come. Take it in our stride. There may be opportunities and not just challenges.
Thank you so much. So that's a wrap. Thank you very much. On behalf of the Council of Board Diversity, thank you to Euleen, Geraldine, Kim, Koon Hean, and Diaan-Yi for taking the time to share your insights with us today. We've come to the end of the conversation and the Council for Board Diversity's 5th anniversary event. On behalf of the Council, I would like to really thank each and every one of you for spending your precious morning with us to join us in commemorating this 5 years. In a VUCA world, 5 years is a very long time. And during this time, we have been really honored to work with many of your organizations on this journey of strengthening boards to chart better strategic direction, manage risk, improve governance, and build resilience. So we trust that you enjoyed this morning's program. Please join me in a round of applause for my brilliant panel here. And we hope to see you at CBD's events in the future. Thank you.